everyone. So I think this is the first recorded PowerPoint you're going to have from me while I'm gone. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. All of the PowerPoints in their original form, like in PowerPoint form, will be on the website just like they always are. And then all of these recordings are basically YouTube videos, so those will be on the website as well. So hopefully that'll be really helpful to you, especially if you're absent or something like that. You can do the lecture at home. And hopefully that'll help you. The other thing, as I convert them to this format, sometimes the formatting gets a little bit funky. So like you'll see on this one, there's a couple words that are cut off. Again, if you want to view it in its original form, it's on the website. But if you pay attention, I'll fill that in for you. If there's something that's cut off or something, I'll tell you what is actually there. Okay, so we're continuing in this unit about the Middle East and Asia, and we're going to learn about Tokugawa Japan. And remember, we're in the time period of 1450 to 1750. So this is when Europeans are going out into the world and exploring and coming into contact with all sorts of new cultures. So the first thing we're going to do, like the first thing on your notes page, is to review what we should already know about Japan from the previous time period. A key thing from the previous time period, 600 to 1450, is that Japan was heavily influenced by one specific country. And hopefully you're thinking about it, and the answer you come up with is China. So remember, Japan was heavily influenced by China in terms of things like Confucianism, which they adopted into their government, also with the spread of Buddhism. And then another important thing is what was the structure of Japan at this time. So the heading here is powerful daimyo. The daimyo, hopefully you remember, are like the landlords. They're like the nobility. If we were in feudalism in Europe, we'd call them the lords or something like that. And another key thing is that the shoguns ruled in name of the emperor. So remember, Japan, when it became feudal, the daimyo lords were always fighting against each other. Like it says here, powerful daimyo used samurai warriors to conquer more territory, and constant wars led to political disarray. So there was tons of civil war as the daimyo were fighting each other for power and land. And so one of the things that developed in Japan is the role of the shogun, who was the military general who ruled over Japan. And part of his job was to hopefully keep the daimyo in check and prevent some of this civil war from happening, but Japan was still feudal and very decentralized, okay? And so the emperor was still there this whole time, but he was really a figurehead and didn't have much power. A series of powerful daimyo gradually united Japan with gunpowder weapons purchased from Portuguese traders. So what happened over time is as Europeans arrived in Asia to trade, some of the Japanese bought weapons, firearms, from these traders, and those people were able to kind of consolidate power and take over from the others that didn't have those types of weapons. And so the most important shogun of this time period is Tokugawa Ieyasu, who became shogun in 1603. And so his family ruled Japan from 1603 until the mid-1800s, which we'll learn about later. And so this period in Japan is called Tokugawa Japan. It's also known as the Great Peace because one of the things he did was to end these civil wars in Japan and kind of bring everybody together as one united government. So that's the answer to number 2, why he was significant. He seized power and was able to consolidate power, stop the daimyo wars, and become one more centralized ruler of Japan. So what were the main goals of this whole system? This is called the shogunate, the time when the shogun rules. It's also called the bakufu, so in your reading you may see that word. It's the same kind of thing. The main goals of the ruling shogun during the Tokugawa period were to limit rebellion and keep the daimyo under control. So they don't want the daimyo lords to have all the power anymore. They want the central government to have more power and to limit the wars between daimyo families. And so they developed different systems to actually be able to do this. One is called the alternative attendance or hostage system. So the daimyo and their families, remember, they're lords. They have big estates out in the countryside, big farms where they have like lots of servants and peasants and all these kind of people who live on their, like in Europe, we'd call it a manor. And so to keep them under control, because they're way out in the country, away from the central government, the government required that the daimyo and their families would live every other year at the Tokugawa court in Edo, which became Tokyo. So in this image, you see the daimyo and the samurai and all the people like coming in and leaving the city of Edo. So every other year they had to travel there, and all the daimyo would have a home or a palace in the capital where they had to live for a certain period of time to allow the shogun and his officials to kind of keep an eye on them and control what they were doing. And even in the off years, when they would go back to their estate, they had to leave at least one family member in the capital so that if they started doing something that the shogun didn't like, he could say threaten that family member. So that's the hostage system, which we've talked about before. Also, another way that they kept them under control is they had to obey a lot of new restrictions and regulations. So for example, if a daimyo family member wants to marry someone from another family, they have to get that approved by the government. And the purpose is that these families can't be making these alliances that are gonna allow them to, say, overthrow the government or seize power or something like that. They have limits on construction projects and building up palaces and things like that. And then again, limits on alliances and meetings. Like they can't hold secret meetings among the families where they plot different things against the government, all those kind of restrictions. They never directly taxed the daimyo, but required them to donate raw materials and labor to government projects. So it's not an official tax, but if the government, say, needs to build new roads, the daimyo would have to provide building materials and provide some of their servants or peasants to go work for the government. So it's like an unofficial tax. And then the last part is a little cut off, but it's basically saying it reorganized Japan into territories to reduce feudalism. So they want Japan now to be structured into like states or provinces run by the government rather than it be seen as like these different territories are for these particular daimyo families. It's just a way of trying to centralize authority over different parts of Japan. So a positive side effect of all of this reorganization politically in Japan is that it definitely helped their economy. Because there was way less civil war, this led to less destruction of farmland and just more people available to be farmers and focus on that rather than focusing always on going to war. And so increased agriculture led to increased population. Eventually, the population grew so much that they even got like a little worried about, are we going to be able to support all these people? And so they tried to limit that. But the positive is that this increased agriculture and population led to increased trade. And so the government did specific things to try to encourage that. They sponsored the building of road networks, like I mentioned before. They increased maritime trade within Japan. So remember, Japan is a series of islands. So they encouraged the different islands within Japan to share resources and trade amongst themselves. The government issued currency to facilitate trade, and we've talked before about how that would help. And then the increased population also led to the increased growth of cities. So Edo, which was the capital, you can see some statistics there of how quickly it grew. From 1600, they had 5,000 people. By 1610, after Tokugawa Ieyasu had taken over and established it as the official capital, like it just exploded in population. And markets were naturally created in these cities because we know whenever people gather together and bring their products, people naturally start trading. And so as cities grew, it enhanced trade even more within Japan. One of the issues that developed as the civil wars of the daimyos ended is what happens to the samurai, because the samurai are this warrior class who've been trained their whole lives to fight, and now people aren't fighting as much. What are they going to do? And so this caused some issues because the samurai now are out of work. They don't really have the same place in society. And so one of the problems that developed is that a lot of the samurai turned to criminal activity as a way to make money since they didn't really have the same role anymore. And so what the Tokugawa government did is encourage them to become salaried members of the government. So they're saying, we want you to come work for the government and we'll pay you a regular salary as any other government official. So the samurai were encouraged to become bureaucrats or scholars working within the government. And so then they would become salaried and they were paid in rice so that they could survive and make a living. Even though the samurai still had this kind of respectful position in society, like people still looked on them honorably, they didn't have the same way to make money and become wealthy and powerful because they're not necessarily being like granted land by daimyo anymore or something like that. And so it just created a lot of tension in society because this social class that had been such a part of history, their role is just dramatically changing. By law, the samurai couldn't be farmers or businessmen. So there were laws about what kind of jobs people could have based on their social class. And so traditionally, people who belonged to the samurai class couldn't have those jobs. So that was another obstacle as these samurai are looking for a new way to make money and survive, that not all options are open to them. And so as the economy of Japan grew, like we just talked about, as trade increased, agriculture increased, the samurai are kind of left out of that. And so this creates issues with samurai revolts and rebellions as they're struggling to find their place in society. So two key things to take away. Again, I would say it led to samurai upheaval, revolts, rebellions, and then samurai were encouraged to become salaried by the government and work as bureaucrats instead of in their traditional position as warriors. There's a lot of culture that comes out of this period in Japan, and I'm not going to talk much about it because there's a lot about it in your homework that you should be doing, but you can just list some examples. So woodblock prints, which we learned about when we studied China 600 to 1450, those were very popular. Poetry such as haiku poetry, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, continued to be a really important part of culture, and a lot of poetry focused on nature and themes of different emotions. Novels, we learned previously about the Tale of Genji and Lady Murasaki and how the modern novel really kind of originated in Japan. That continued to be a popular form of literature. And then kabuki theater, which you see some examples here, a type of theater that became very popular form of entertainment, especially among the upper classes, really developed during the Tokugawa period. So the last major thing is, how did Japan change and react as Europeans came to Asia looking to trade and also looking to spread their religion and culture? So one of the first Europeans that played a large role in Japan was the Jesuit priest Francis Xavier. And we've learned about the Jesuits and how one of the major focuses of the Jesuit Catholic priest was missionary activity. So they went throughout the world, like we talked about them a lot in Latin America, trying to convert the Native Americans. One of their goals is to convert people and find followers for the Catholic Church. All right, so Francis Xavier arrived in 1549 to convert the Japanese to Christianity. Initially, this religion appealed to people. Some people converted just because they liked the religion, but other daimyo saw this as an opportunity to establish trade relationships with Europeans, and so they may have converted for that reason. So they had a common religious tie. Eventually, however, as Christianity spread and caught on in Japan, there was a backlash against it, especially by the Japanese Tokugawa government, who saw it as a threat to traditional Japanese culture and religion. So they saw Christianity spreading and thought, we're going to lose kind of the things that make us traditionally Japanese, like say Shintoism and other religious things like that. And so the shoguns started to restrict European access to Japan to try to maintain their own authority and not let European culture overtake them. One of the things that they had a problem with, especially with Christianity, is that Christianity says there's only one God, you can have no other gods. There's only one true faith, okay? You believe in Jesus, that's it. All these other religions in the world are not true religions. But in Japan, remember, they'd had a history of blending religion. So like they'd had Shintoism, they'd practiced that alongside things like Buddhism. They had elements of Confucianism come in. So people were used to more of a blending of beliefs in a lot of cases. And Christianity really didn't allow that, especially as taught by the Catholic priests. And so that all caused the upper class people, the government, to really try to not allow Christianity to keep spreading. And so this led the Tokugawa government to try to close off Japan from European contact. And so after 1639, this part is cut off here, but I'll tell you what it says. After 1639, they restricted the movement of Europeans very much within Japan. The only group of Europeans that could even come to Japan and trade were the Dutch, who established a special trading relationship with the Japanese, and they were limited only to one port at Nagasaki. So the key thing here is initially Europeans came in, they brought religion and technology that Japanese people were interested in. But the Japanese government made a very conscious decision to close off their country to prevent too much European influence from coming in, and they thought that that would help them preserve their culture. And so from the 1600s, from 1639 until the mid-1800s, which we'll learn about later, Japan was mostly what we call a closed country, where there was more limited contact between Japan and Europe than in a lot of other places like, say, India, where Europeans could come and go much more freely. So that's a quick summary of Tokugawa Japan.